The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, and welcome to our second of 4 webinars for Board Development Month 2019. Tonight's topic, Board 102, Who's Going to Do That? Board Structures and Committees. This is one of my favorite topics because so often in the boardroom, ideas come up and it's kind of like, oh no, what are we going to do with this great idea? So tonight's webinar is going to look at that. When is it the board's role? When is it the committee's role? What are committees? How do you get people on them? All of the fun things. So, a little bit about us here at Grow and Lead. We're a nonprofit organization that helps communities throughout Michigan's Upper Peninsula be a great place for kids to grow up. So, one of the ways we do this is by providing trainings like tonight's, where we're strengthening the nonprofit sector, because as you know, many nonprofit sector organizations provide those things that are critical for our communities and our youth to thrive. So, welcome. We have 2 more webinars in these series. Next week, we will have board and staff relationship. And the week after that, we'll cover strategic planning. So if you haven't signed up for those yet, you can visit our website, glcyd.org, and register. They are also free, and they will be happening at 6 p.m., just like this evening's session. With that, I am excited to hand it over to Chad Mager, an associate here at Grow and Lead.
Thank you, Victoria. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your evening, if you've just got done with work or whatever it is, to join with us tonight and talk about this subject. So if you were here last week, we covered Board 101, which is our basic roles and responsibilities as board members. And tonight we're going to take it just a little bit further down that rabbit hole, so to speak. So, but just to really quickly, the thing to remember when we're talking about going to the next step is it's always important to remember the basic responsibilities and duties as a board member. So just as a quick review, we're going to go over some of those duties of a board member, so we're all on the same page, because everything you do on the board should be in light of or with this in mind. Keeping these 3 legal duties of a board member: duty of care, paying attention to the activities and operations, making sure you're informed, ready to act on behalf and make decisions on behalf of the organization as part of your voting. Your duty of loyalty, which puts the interest of the organization before your own. That's a pretty important one. The duty of obedience, with when you're complying with all the different laws, regulations, especially your organization's bylaws, are important to make sure you're operating within those. Because the board is ultimately the guardians of the mission of the organization, to make sure it's doing the work that it's telling the public that it's doing. So another kind of a little quick review. These are the different work of the board that hopefully you're doing, hopefully you're taking responsibility for as a board member. We have board operations, which includes how the makeup of your board, who's on it, the recruiting of board members, training and giving an orientation to those new board members, ongoing training for those who've been serving for a while, and assessment of the functionality of the board. So making sure that things are working effectively, efficiently. You're supposed to give yourself an assessment. And the structure, the makeup of your board, which also includes your officers, your committees, again, which we'll talk about those kind of things this evening. You're definitely responsible for the strategic planning, setting the stage, setting the goals for the future for the organization, pointing them in the right direction. That's a board responsibility. Working obviously with your executive. Also resource developments, mentioning financial, human, and physical resources. All those are vital to any organization. Again, the board is committing to making sure those things are in place and taken care of, and there's good oversight to all of those things, which is the next one: oversight of the different parts of the organization, especially finances, keeping yourself legal and also then being just kind of a watchdog over the programming to make sure, again, that it's following mission. And lastly, you serve as ambassadors to talk up your organization and get people to support the good work you're hopefully doing. So that's in everything we talk about tonight, in structures and committees, etc. You have to really think about it through the lens of your work as the board and your 3 legal duties as a board member. So everything should look through that lens. So let's get right into it after the review here and talk about the different structures that you can use to carry out your duties as a board. There are primarily 3 different types of structures for boards: a working board, a governing board, and an institutional board. And I'll give you some definitions of each of those. Interesting thing is, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is that this is actually a life cycle of an organization. Almost every organization starts off with a working board. Most nonprofits do. And as you grow and as you just develop and become more of a mature organization, you'll slowly work your way through different steps. Sometimes many never make the institutional level, but definitely there is a point in time where an organization kind of grows out of a working board into a governing board. So we'll start off with a little graph here to show you a working board structure. All 3 of those levels I'd mentioned, working, governing, institutional. This working board, think of it as a brand new startup. You have passionate people, a handful of people who are passionate about some unmet need in your community or some cause, and they come together and they say, hey, we need to do something about this. So how are we going to tackle this problem? So they talk, they meet, they discuss, they come up with plans. And at some point someone says, we need to formalize this. We need to start like our own nonprofit to tackle this problem. So typically what happens, that first initial startup phase, everyone's on board. So you have a half dozen people coming together with this passion and this mission in mind. And what do they do when it comes to the organization? They get all their stuff filed, they become an actual nonprofit, they're all ready to go, and they're about to start the work. And who's going to do the work? That's right, those 6 people or dozen or whatever it is that started it up. There is no hired staff. You're not paying someone. It's just starting off brand new. And so every level of the organization, these board members and volunteers are the ones doing all the work. They're doing everything from setting the goals and the policies and the budgets to managing the funds and helping in fundraising and doing the actual work, down to the bottom level where they're volunteering at every function, at every chance to serve, and sometimes acting in the role of the service agent or the one delivering the services, because there is no staff and it's just a completely volunteer group of people. So that's a working board structure. Now, the working board structure can last for years. Sometimes it gets a little more formalized, where the board has more policies in place. The structure becomes more, not rigid, but more formal, so that there's some things in place. Perhaps there's volunteers that take on a greater role, and the board members kind of step back and try to assume more of a board-like position. These transitions, by the way, are extremely hard. You have founders syndrome, if anyone's heard of that. It's where the people who found the organization, or if there's an individual who founded it, have a hard time giving up control as the organization grows up, so to speak, and it ages and matures. So sometimes founding board members who have had their hands in everything have a hard time giving that up, because they've been at every single level of the organization, because they essentially were the organization. So, but as it gets going, and sometimes you bring on more board members who are new to the organization, who don't see themselves as hands-on, and they want to just kind of sit back and kind of give advice to whatever's in place, a structure. Sometimes they get to a place where you hire your first staff person, that leader of the organization, that director or executive or whatever you want to call it, coordinator. And now things get really interesting, because now you have paid staff that's supposed to carry out the work. But now you have a board who's so used to doing everything. and they have a hard time, and either one of two things happen. Either number one, the leader takes things by the reins and kind of runs with it, and the board just follows the leader and says, yep, that's what we hired him for. But what happens in that situation is, even when given tasks to do, tasks they may have done in the past, that kind of a board that follows the leader in that way will start to drop the ball because, well, we had that paid person to do that. The other type of thing that can happen is that the board won't give up control, and the poor leader who's hired to do a job feels frustrated and kind of cut off at every angle because they can't get the work done because someone else on the board saying, no, I got this, or no, I do this, or someone-so does this. So there's the two things. When it gets to that point in your organization where you feel that tension, where things aren't quite working, whether it's the board's disengaged because they're letting the paid staff do everything, and they're really kind of just rubber stamping things, or it gets to the point where the board can't give up the hands-on volunteer roles that they've played for so long to let the paid staff person really take the more active role in deciding the day-to-day tasks. Those 2 points of tension really are pointing towards the potential shift, where the organization needs to grow up a little bit and change a little bit of their structure and how they do go about the work of the organization. It rarely lasts forever. There are some that stay volunteer organizations forever, but that's actually not really common, especially if there's growth. And usually what happens at some point, the founding people, members of the organization age and are either go through different parts of life cycle and can no longer do what they used to do. And with a board that's never given up control, they find it very difficult to replace themselves because no one wants to take on the vast amount of work and hands-on that they have been doing, that the originators have been doing for so long. It was like, whoa, that's a lot of work. And the original people had the passion. They had the mindset when they started this thing to get this off the ground. So they had the will to do so, but finding someone else to match that later on becomes difficult. So that becomes an issue with one. So as we deal with those tensions, it looks to a point where you're going to get to a point where you just can't sustain what you're doing as a working board anymore, or quite honestly, it's just not functioning well. So that either they're, again, too hands-on, or they're just disconnected. The board that sits back and goes, yes, you're doing a good job. And the executive director or coordinator just reports at every board meeting. They go, yep, good. But they're not doing anything but just saying yes and sounds good and rubber stamping the activities, but they're not really adding. There's no value added. They're just kind of there in a role, and they need to be stretched and pushed and reminded, going back to those duties and those works of the board, that there's more to be done. So even though you've hired a person, there's more work to be done for a board member. You're not done once you have a hired staff. In fact, the work has just begun. So there's the working board structure, very hands-on, more informal as far as the roles go, because it's all hands on deck. It's everybody's got to pitch in to make this thing happen. Again, typically smaller organizations. So that's the working board structure. So once again, going back to that tension point, you feel like it's time to be something different, and you kind of graduate into a governing board structure. Now this one, what's different about this is this board really steps back from that hands-on role. What I mean by that, though, is do they stop volunteering? No. Board members probably still volunteer, but now their actions as volunteers, they're not leading events, they're not making decisions, they're letting the staff person really make those calls on a day-to-day basis. When they show up to volunteer, they truly are a volunteer. They're not the head of something and trying to direct and make decisions. They are just following, hopefully, the direction of whoever the paid staff and leaders. So what they do is they serve more, again, more of the bird's eye view that a board, a really healthy board, looking at that vision and strategy and figuring out the long-term goals and objectives of the organization to help with that leader to know where the organization is going. So really this shift from doing the work of the organization on every level to really being that guiding force that really kind of is the foundation behind the organization to help move them forward. And one of the ways that a governing board does it is by forming these strategic committees that usually address a specific area of need in the organization, and then they'll work to help shore up those areas and help problem solve in those separate areas so that the mission can be fulfilled even on a greater level. It's actually maximizing what they do. Whereas the working board was hands-on work, they actually can accomplish more in this governing board structure by working through committees because it's actually sharing the load. You actually can bring in more people and more advice and expertise in a committee structure than you typically would do in the working board structure, because all the time spent in the working board structure is just making the thing go. It's just making the organization keep functioning. So governing board really is taking that step back, looking at the big picture. That's what a governing board does. Looks at the big picture, then looks at the need areas of the organization and say, okay, wait, where's the best way we can help serve? Let's do a committee that does like one, excuse me a second there, I'm having technical problems here all of a sudden. Looks at finances on a deeper level to make sure that there's nothing going wrong. That looks at fund development or fundraising to help get more of the needed resources to help the mission move forward. These are just a couple examples of potential strategic committees. Sometimes strategic committees are very short term or very, very specific. A capital campaign committee. There could be an issue with something legal that happens that a committee is formed to help address that. Sometimes when there needs to be an overhaul of policies and procedures, or a relook at the bylaws, or recruiting new board members, or et cetera. All these different committees that can be helped to address a need and propel forward the work of the agency. So this board, again, sets the budget, sets the policies, allows the paid staff and their volunteers under them to get the hands-on work done. And the board sits back and helps direct things from that upper level, really working in a strong partnership with that paid director or coordinator. So that's a governing board structure. All right, moving on. Institutional board structure. This is kind of like the big boys. This is for the larger organizations. There's very much a clear separation of staff and board roles. I mean, very clear. The board focuses on just really the ends and limitations, staff focusing on means. This institutional board structure is what you typically see in like a corporation or a institution of higher learning, or well, a lot of our hospitals have moved to for-profit, but a lot of hospitals that are still nonprofits have this very formal structure of institutional board structure. So they're very much detached from the rest of the organization and make high-level decisions and really focus on the end goal, and less about how the work gets done, and less about and actually, to be honest, how it often works, they serve less in a volunteering capacity than either of the other two board structures. They're just kind of separated and apart from looking at the big picture on a very high level and very long-term level. So that's the institutional. Again, if you're from the UP, there's only a handful of these around. Most of our nonprofit organizations tend to be at the working or governing board structure level. So again, to talk about the importance here is that it really is a life cycle. So you start off in your birth, the organization is that working board where everyone needs to come on board, and everyone's there's not enough money to pay anyone to get the work done, so everyone's just volunteering their time to do all different levels. They think about the vision, they try to even do a strategic planning event to help them plan for the future, because no one has time to do it on their own, so they want to do it together. So they do that. They show up to every fundraiser together. They distribute or do the service of whatever they do. They're all hands-on. And as the time grows, program grows, organization grows, they start feeling the strain that kind of all-in type thing. There's not a lot of people that will join in that commitment or that much invested as the original founders. And so you may have to get a staff person. Once you do, you have that unique dynamic. And again, it keeps growing until you go, okay, we can't do this anymore. We need to really let that person have their autonomy as a hired staff, and the board will take a step back and look at the big picture and be more governing, set up committees to help guide and support the vision and mission. And finally, if it grows so big, it can become that institutional type of board. So that's the life cycle. This picture is just, I really love that it doesn't show the life cycle of boards, but it really does show a cycle for organizations. There's some sort of discovery adversity. We look at our capabilities and skills to solve it, come up with a mission or a vision, and then with our desire and enthusiasm, try to solve that problem. So that's pretty much nonprofits. All right. So remember, this is important to know too. This is the 3 hats of role clarity, just to review for someone who may have been on last week's as well. The fact that as a board member, you have these three different ways that you serve and 3 different hats you wear. We talked about the governance and the 3 different types of structures of boards already this evening. They're all the formal, when you're acting as a board member, when you're in the boardroom, when you have quorum, and then your votes are what really make and change the direction of your organization. That's your governance role. But what we're going to switch to now is part of that implementation role. This is now some of the work, especially in the governing board structure. This implementation stage is when you're delegated to do a specific task or oversee or work on a specific area, which we commonly call committees or task forces. So this is, again, the board will say, we need to solve this issue. Let's come up with a group of us, a smaller group of us, to work specifically on this. And we're going to set the parameters for that group, this committee, and say that they can deal with this topic, and here's their so to speak, their boundaries. They can only operate in this, and they can make decisions and come back to the board and offer up those findings to take it to a vote. So that's kind of where the committees come in. So let's kind of jump right into them. I thought herding sheep might not be very complimentary, so I'd pick cattle. They're a little bit more obedient with committees. So let's talk about the various committees and the different roles a committee serves. So as I mentioned, it's very specific authority. Again, I'll pick on finance. So the finance committee is really looking at the books to make sure the ins and outs of what's coming in, going out, how it's being managed, how it's being recorded, all that stuff is keeping up to speed. Finance doesn't go and tell board governance how to recruit new board members or how to change a policy. They can make suggestions if something's not working, but their role is really to look at the finance. That's their specific lane, so to speak. They stay in their lane. It's a great analogy, actually, for a committee. You stay in your lane. And then they work on that, and then they'll report to the board and make recommendations to the board. Obviously, finance committees are the ones who will look at investments, if there's any investments. If sometimes if there's loans that the organization may have come out. So these kind of different recommendations to the board to say to renew something, to change, to maybe a different spending structure. So the finance will bring these recommendations to the board for the board to vote on. So the committee itself doesn't have the authority to make the change. The board itself does, but they do the work so that not the whole board has to be spending time hashing through these smaller issues that can be done with a smaller group. So two different types of committees you can have are standing committees. Standing committees meaning that they're ongoing. You just have them automatically set up, or they can be, you can see all the different words I use, like more temporary, ad hoc, sometimes even just a simple work group to accomplish a specific task. Big fundraisers are probably one of the most common, like, temporary work groups. Like, okay, we have a big fundraiser, who wants to help? And so they'll set up a work group to tackle something like that, of that magnitude. So, okay, so committee structure. This is something that I did a lot of research on and kind of changed course. I used to be someone who really thought standing committee was definitely the way to go. Like, set them up, you know what your big areas are that really need constant attention or work, so just set them up and let them run. But the more I dug into it, I realized that sometimes flexibility is good, and organizations, like people, change. They change over time. Their needs change. Sometimes different parts of your direction changes as you set new goals or have a new strategic plan. So sometimes it may not be the best interest of the organization to have standing committees. Some of you might say, hey, it's working for us, we do it, it's working great. That's awesome. Well, what we see a lot of times with standing committees, one of the only big drawbacks or negatives about it is that they kind of get stale or apathetic. Not that they don't care about what they're doing, but just like everyone's like, okay, well, what are we meeting for this month? Okay, well, we don't have much to work on. So, and whoever wants to be a part of that kind of a situation, and I bet you we've all been there. It's like, why are we meeting again? Just because we have to have a meeting? So sometimes having less structure or not having standing committees can give everyone a specific task to work on, and when it's done, you dissolve the work group or the committee. So what I meant by in the first place about not set in stone, some of you probably have in your bylaws your standing committees. The only good or bad, whatever it is what it is. The negative that is, you have to, as board members, as the whole board of directors, have to adhere to your bylaws. So therefore you have to have those committees because they're in your bylaws. Whereas if you were to change your bylaws and say something, committees will be formed as they are needed for whatever length of time needed. Some of them you might find out end up being pretty much standing committees anyway, but some may not have to meet on that kind of regular basis to get the job done. And so you don't have to be stuck trying to fill out and recruit for certain committees that may not be needed on a regular basis or an ongoing basis. So ultimately, the board really needs to look at what the needs of the organization are, what the needs of the board are, and make sure that those committees reflect meeting those needs. That's the ultimate goal. So again, if you can get by with a handful of committees and the work is getting done, there's nothing that's being left out or forgotten, you're good to go. But sometimes things pop up and go, whoa, we're changing a little bit of direction. We have something XYZ coming up in the future. We need to plan for that. We need to be ready for that. And so maybe a committee needs to be formed to get out in front of that before you're dealing with it. So again, reevaluate. If you have an annual meeting, if you have times where you're looking at your organization, you're looking at your board structures, great time to look at your committee structures and make sure it's addressing the issues you need before they even come up. Again, if you have a strategic plan, if you've been in active planning, ongoing planning as a board, look to those goals and say, what are we going to need to accomplish these goals? And then fit your committees to attain those goals. Again, it allows some flexibility. Remember, the board can set up as many committees as they want. Yes, I think I heard a collective groan through the internet. You can set up as many committees as you want to get the job done, or as few as necessary to get the job done. One thing I would caution, I worked with one small nonprofit, and I mean very small nonprofit, who in their bylaws had 9 committees. 9 committees. They had 9 members on their board, and they they were very faithful to trying to fill all those committees. But what it was board members were burning themselves out by having to sit on multiple committees for multiple meetings, including the regular board meeting. And they didn't even have one of the big things I will tell you about in a little bit, which is a key to making sure committees work really well and don't burn out your board. So this poor organization was struggling mightily because they had so many committees to fill. So one of the things I worked with them is trying to change their bylaws to really kind of hack away and get down to the absolute necessities of the committees they really needed, and found that some of them that had listed even were so close to another one listed that it was easy to combine them and combine the duties and give them actually something to work on, rather than, again, simply meeting for the sake of the meeting because it's in your bylaws. So some really common and practical examples for committees. There's the governance. The governance committee is like your it is that assessing part of the board. In other words, they work on the recruiting of new board members. Often they're given the task of coming up with an orientation and recruiting policies or practice or procedures or whatever it is, so that when those new people are recruited, they have an orientation, they get up to speed, they know how to serve. They also are responsible for the ongoing training, or coming up with or inviting people for ongoing board training. So hopefully you have opportunities to continue to hone your skills, know how to serve even better. Maybe if it's even signing up as a group to listen to a webinar, whatever it is. But the board governance committee will be the ones that makes those suggestions. So, and they also are the ones that review the bylaws. They'll review any policies or procedures that might happen, whether it's the board level or the executive director or coordinator can come to them and ask them to look at other policies in the organization, or find experts who might help. But again, they really are the policing, so to speak, of the board. So they're responsible for really helping maintain the board, maintain its structure, maintain its membership, making sure there's adequate replacements, and there's succession plans for officers and people with key skills that are necessary to do the work of the organization. So that's the board governance. That's a very common one, because again, without someone actively working on replacing board members as they term off or just move on because of life situations, you'll find yourself very quickly in a situation where you don't have a full board, or you're struggling to find people to put on your board. So a governance committee can really help make so that doesn't happen, so that you always have potential candidates that are being looked at, being vetted, being discussed and talked to, and hopefully even groomed to get to a place where they're ready to serve on the board. The next common committee is, I called it development to lump it all in, but it's what I call the fund development. The fundraising is probably the most common term I hear, but I kind of bristle when I hear fundraising committee, because it sounds like event planning whenever you say fundraising, or yeah, because that's just the most typical thing people think of when think of fundraising is events. But that's why you like to use the phrase fund development, because there's much more ways to try to raise funds for your organization than just holding a fundraiser. So some of those include capital campaigns. Some of it include individual donor asks or visitations. Sometimes that would include grant writing. So this development committee, this fund development or fundraising committee, is really looking at ways to generate and get more funding for the organization. And there's so many ways they can do it. But they're the ones who like to brainstorm new ideas, come up with, yes, sometimes events, but really strategize on how best to raise funds for the organization. They'll be the first ones that will bring a grant idea to the board and say, hey, we think this is a really good opportunity. We'd like to spend the time. Sometimes they're the ones who actually write the grants or work with the coordinator director to actually write a grant, because they want to be that they're the social butterflies a lot of times because they like throwing events, or they have a network of people, and they're not afraid to go out and get more people on board to help come up with the funds necessary to run the programming. Finance committee, I think I've mentioned several times, they're really the ones that look at the dollars and cents to make sure that everything's being accounted for in a proper legal manner, protecting the organization, protecting the board, even protecting the executive director. No executive director or coordinator should be concerned or fearful of a finance committee because they're protecting everybody by making sure the money is where it's supposed to be and being used for what it's supposed to be. The executive committee is actually made up of the officers. Depending on your structure, it's your board president, vice president, or you might call them your chairperson, vice chair, treasurer, secretary. It could be 3 people or 4. Not all organizations have a vice president or vice chair. But the executive committee is extremely important. They work more closely with your executive director or coordinator, whoever that lead person is, paid person for the organization. They work very closely. So in between times when the board's not meeting, remember again, going back to 101, the board only has power when they're meeting in session, when a quorum's reached, when they can vote on things. So sometimes things pop up in the timeliness of life and whatever that needs to be addressed right away. And you can't call the whole board. There's not enough time to go through the processes to call the whole board. Well, the executive committee often has given, within their powers and their parameters, the ability to make those quick short-term decisions to help keep the organization going forward. So they probably meet a little bit more often than the others do because they are a little more hands-on-y kind of thing, working with the leader of your organization. So, but vitally important. I know, talking to leaders of nonprofit organizations, that they really they value all the committees. They value the board. Obviously, it's who's they go to, but the executive committee really serves as a support role, an encouraging role for that leader and helping get things done. So there are potential and possibilities for so many different other committees that could be very specific to what you do, what your organization needs. But these are ones that we find that are very common throughout most organizations. One that's very popular these days is a marketing or public relations or that kind of a committee, which works to build your profile, your public awareness. Some people lump that in with your fund development, since kind of building your public awareness, you're looking for money at the same time, but not necessarily. Sometimes they want to have a separate committee for that, really just to build awareness. And sometimes there's different skill sets, people who understand social media and other avenues of communication to get those out. So they like to have a separate marketing or public relations type committee. So there's just some examples, but the biggest thing is, when I mentioned earlier, go back to what your needs are in your organization. Have a discussion saying, where are we going in the next year or two? What kind of committees would help us propel forward the mission? Don't set up a committee just to have a committee, just to check off one of these boxes here. Well, Chad said we needed it, so we need it. If your organization doesn't need it right now in its life cycle, then don't do it. The last thing you want to do is burn out board members by having a bunch of different extra responsibilities. With that in mind, I'll go to my very next point, is this one. Don't rely just on board members to fill your committees. There is nothing that says your committees are made up of just board members. Now, committees need to have board representation on them. That is very important because, again, the board's giving these specific and powers, and they want to have someone who's there for accountability, who can speak on the behalf of the board. So a board member on a committee, 1, 2 is even better, is awesome. But the rest of who makes up the committee does not have to be board members. So many small organizations burn out their board members by thinking that this is what it means, that they have to just be board members. Committees can be anybody. Have someone who's talented in finances, maybe an accountant, a financial planner, whatever it might be, someone who's in banking and wants to serve on your finance committee but doesn't have the time to be a full-fledged board member. Great. Grab them. Have them come out to your occasional committee meetings to look at the finances on a quarterly or whatever basis. That's great. You have someone who's a social butterfly, has no interest in serving on a board, but loves to do fundraising, loves talking to people, loves getting the word out there. Great. Recruit them for your fund development committee. Or if they have talents in graphic design or social media, with your marketing committee or your public relations. Do you see what I'm getting at here? It's the way you find to really help make committees work best is by finding more voices, more diversity, more talent than you have just on your board. If your board's an average size with a dozen people, there's only so much those people can do, even with their volunteering. And again, believe me, so many board members across the UP serve on multiple organizations, so their time is stretched. So how can these committees really function and operate well? If you have more people willing to give their time that don't have the time commitments that the board member, a full-fledged board member, does. So look in your community. Your board governance committee can actually also work on not just looking for potential candidates to serve on the board, but also the committees. So you could give them that task to say, all right, try to find us more people. And again, they're going to come back to you as a full board and say, all right, we need names. We'll approach them. We'll vet them. We'll look for them, but we need names. So look for opportunities to really grow your organization, including more people, especially those with the specific talents that you need to accomplish your mission and goals, and get them on a committee. Because one other thing that committees serve as a great place for is eventual board appointing. In other words, someone serves on a committee, they didn't want to commit too much, they serve on a committee, they enjoy what they're doing, they get to understand the ins and outs of your organization on a deeper level than if they're just a volunteer at a specific event. No, they're on a committee, they're helping work on something, a goal. And they find they really like the organization, they like the mission, they like the people, and eventually they could become a candidate for the board. And it's a great way to kind of help ease someone into potential board membership. So look for those people to serve on your committees. Don't rely just on yourselves internally, because you will burn yourselves out. Remember, a healthy committee has a goal and objective. They have a purpose. One of the worst things to do is get to a committee that doesn't have anything to do. If you get to that point, it's better to dissolve it or stop meeting than to have meetings that have no value. The 4 that I gave you, there is always something to be done in those areas. Always. You'll never run out of stuff to do. The executive gets a little bit iffier because their purpose is more fluid, to help with the director and help with guidance and propelling forward. But the other ones have specific goals and purposes and plenty of work to do. You'll never run out of work to do. But again, if you have a specific committee that's different than those, that's meant to do a specific maybe a building project, maybe whatever it is, when that's done, don't keep the building committee because, well, they can keep care of maintenance and whatever. But no, once their task is done, dissolve the committee, move on, because otherwise the people will get bored and discouraged. Have your guidelines for committees in writing. The board really should set this up. They should really, when they form the committee, set the guidelines. This saves you big time in the long run, because committees sometimes like to overstep their given tasks or authority. So the more clear their guidelines and responsibilities are, the better for everybody, especially when you're talking about committees that might have non-board members on it who might get influential or whatever. It's important to have those guidelines and parameters set in place so no one tries to get away with stuff they shouldn't, or make decisions when they shouldn't, when really, again, committees are supposed to be recommending and showing their work to the board, not being independent and just doing whatever they want. If you don't keep minutes for your committee meetings, I really suggest you do. It's hard to go back and say, well, we made this decision if it's only an oral presentation and you don't have any actual minutes or records of what's happened and decisions that have been made. So it doesn't have to be exhausting minutes or anything, but just if it's decisions made and who is present and why you made that decision, it helps when reporting to the board to know how you came to that decision. And rather than just like, do you remember who said that or what said that, and causing more confusion and problems. So yeah, so again, committees can be a very huge positive, can be a big positive to an organization in helping you move your mission forward. It can help you streamline. Has anyone ever been worried about 2-hour board meetings? If you have committees, your board meetings should be drastically cut down in time. Committees make a short report, usually written and short verbal report in each board meeting. And now unless there's an issue to be voted on or discussed, there's not a bunch of extra discussion going on. Has anyone sat in a board meeting where you talked about the next fundraiser for an hour? Yeah, see, that should be done in committee work. That shouldn't be dealt with at the board level. That should be tabled and left for a committee to work on. And if anyone has any big questions or concerns, they can go to that committee chairperson or go to that committee meeting and air their concerns or ideas or whatever. But you can shorten up your board meetings considerably by having committees that are active, functioning, and working within their roles and their goals. So if you want to get rid of a big, long 2-hour meetings, think about setting up active committees. It'll save you a lot of time. So recruiting committee members, yes, that's one of those common things we hear. Oh, it's easier said than done. It's not easy, but again, if you really find someone who has talent in the area you're looking for, again, they're not always easy to find, but if you do find them and you kind of really sandwich the whole conversation within, like, we need your help, here's what we're doing, and you wouldn't have to have the commitment of a full board thing. Sometimes that alone will get someone to be agreeable to serve on a committee, whereas they might not be ready for full board membership. But don't be afraid to ask people to serve. One of our biggest shortcomings when it comes to any kind of work on a board, and especially on committees, is we're afraid to ask people because we think they're too busy. We think whatever, but we got to give them an opportunity to say yes or no. So don't be afraid to go out and look for people to serve on committees that can enhance your organization, that can really bring a helping hand, and help shoulder the load for board members who often feel overworked. It's one or two extremes of board members. They either feel overworked or they feel like they're not contributing enough. So hopefully committees will help with both of those two things. Because you're saying, how so? Because again, no one wants a 2 to 3 hour board meeting. That's where people get really bogged down. And that's where they feel overworked and where they're responsible for doing all different parts if they're a working board with hands-on. Whereas a committee says, nope, you're responsible for your board, your overall oversight as a board member, and one committee. And there's your lane. Stay in your lane, and you kind of help with that. It actually lessens the load on a board member than trying to be involved in making decisions on everything all the time, and having all those conversations. And so that's the overloaded. The ones who are not involved, this will make them feel far more active and invested in your organization if they're serving on a committee. Very common structure for those you're going, I'll never get my board to add another meeting. Right? Some of you meet on a monthly basis for your board meetings. The question the board can ask itself, is that necessary? Do you need to meet that often? Because sometimes a lot of organizations have switched to this structure in my recent work, is that they meet 1 month for the full board, And the next month, they schedule their individual committee meetings where they get some of the work done. And then in the next month, so it's in every other month. So you're still only having one meeting a month, but you're actually doing the oversight and acting as the voice of the organization for one meeting, the board meeting, and the next month you're working on the details and the recommendations and the work that needs to get done so you can function more efficiently and effectively as a board. So that's something to consider. Talk about that as a board to say, hey, maybe we can switch this structure, get more stuff done, get things more solidified, formalized, have more creativity, more ideas, generations, all that kind of stuff by working through committees, and then also having less formal board meetings to every other month. So that's just one way to keep the meeting numbers the same, but actually accomplishing more in the long run. All right, so we've talked about the different structures from a working to a governing to an institutional board tonight. We talked about the roles of committees, why they're important, how they can help us get the work done in an organization without burning out your board members, actually making it easier for them to do their jobs and get their tasks done. So with that, that's pretty much what we have for this evening. Victoria, do we have anyone who wrote any questions into this evening or any further thoughts from you?
No questions yet at this time, but if you do have a question you'd like to type into the questions box, go ahead and raise your hand and type your question, and Chad and I will hang out and answer questions for you. One thing I did want to touch on, in last week's evaluation, someone asked a question specifically about the executive committee, which I know Chad touched on tonight. And I did want to mention, especially if you're a startup, writing your bylaws is a really critical part of how much power the executive committee has, because you do outline in those bylaws that committee, who's going to be on it, what they're going to be able to do outside of board meetings. So if you are interested in the executive committee's role and you're an established nonprofit, check out your bylaws, and it's going to give you a lot of information on that committee. And if you are in the startup phase, going and researching what other people do with their executive committees, look it up online. We have a few versions of sample bylaws at our office that we can share. Just kind of look at what other people are doing and craft your executive committee to be what fits the need of your organization.
And I'm going to jump on that, Victoria. I'm so glad you brought that up because, excuse me, I've seen different organizations that give different amount of power to that executive committee. And sometimes it can really be a stumbling block. In other words, if it's not a startup and it's established and they have this certain powers in their bylaws for that executive committee, and the executive committee starts making decisions and failing to inform the rest of the board of the work they're doing, saying, hey, it's in the bylaws, we can make these decisions. So make sure, especially if you're a startup, you know exactly how much leeway you're giving those executives. If you're currently in an established one and you want to take a look at it and go, whoa, that's a little bit uncomfortable, you may need a discussion about how much. And some people are fine with the executive committee having considerable power. But again, I've actually ran into 2 examples in the last year of an executive committee, a small group of people, only a few, making big decisions and then not informing the rest of the board, which again is not how that's supposed to work. They're given the power often to make decisions, but they still need to report to the full board, not the full. So anyway, very good. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions in the question box at this time, so I think we'll wrap it up. I will be sending out a link to tonight's recording along with a copy of the slides via email tomorrow. In that, it will also copy Chad on it, so if you have questions that pop up as you're thinking about what you learned tonight, feel free to shoot him an email and he will definitely respond. Right, Chad?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, have a great night, everyone, and thank you for joining us.